Hello, my name is Stephen Hunt, and this is Dodging Bullets, the Insolvency Practitioner's Guide to Surviving the Week. In this episode, my guest is Stephen Cork, a well-known name in insolvency, but not as well known as, is it your great uncle?
It would be my great uncle, Sir Kenneth Cork, who was the son of the founder, W.H. Cork, a firm dating back to 1906. So Sir Kenneth would have taken over the firm just after the end of the Second World War.
Well, I've got my copy of Cork on Cork with me. I quoted it in the very first episode of these podcasts because I've always found it fascinating to read about insolvency back in the day and his stories of how work was obtained in the sort of 1940s, 1950s and sort of dodgy creditors meetings and how he wouldn't be part of the crowd. I found very inspiring. So I don't know if you followed the same. Have you followed the same route? Have you had interesting moments in the profession?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to take a step back over the years, conscious with regard to sort of one or two rogue operators that we've dealt with. Probably in the earlier years of my career, I think it was particularly acute in terms of manipulation of creditor meetings. I remember on the odd occasion, I'd be opposite the proposed liquidator who would then suggest to those creditors in the room that, would we be interested in acquiring any of the assets? Which wholly inappropriate. Whether it was there to obtain a rise or whether or not they genuinely believed that creditors sitting in that room would be interested in acquiring the furniture is unclear, but it just shows the abuse. But that was 20, 25 years ago.
I do miss some of the real creditor days. There's some fantastic ones that went on. One I remember particularly was the director had basically brought friends and family along to sit in a circle around me in the creditors meeting. And when I stood up to speak, they'd boo and hiss. So after my initial thing, I got up and moved to the other side, and they all got up and moved with me and carried on hissing as I spoke. It was hilarious. I won the vote. I miss those days.
Your reputation clearly had preceded you.
Yes, quite. So yes, I mean, in looking a little bit in the family history, I saw that Sir Kenneth was known as an insolvency baron. I hadn't come across that phrase before, but apparently the insolvency barons of the late 70s were the sort of big beasts of the insolvency world that were really carving out the industry, making it what it is today, I suppose.
Yeah, I haven't seen reference to baron before, but certainly Sir Kenneth and his brother Norman were particularly influential in the 1970s, particularly where you had the banking crisis of the 1970s. That was a huge opportunity for the firm. In terms of Sir Kenneth's impact, I mean, he had very strong relationships with the banks at a very senior level. Perhaps times have moved on in terms of particular groups within a bank looking at workouts, but at that time it was a board level. And Kenneth would be in a position to phone up the head of Barclays, and he would take his call. So I think a reflection with regard to the dominance that they had at that time in the market.
Well, I saw reference to that period where he effectively it's described as the Cork Dam.
That's right. Yeah.
But in fact, what it was a period where assets could be sold to repay creditors, effectively a form of administration and protection for a company. And you could see how his work was developing the ideas that would become the 1986 Act.
Yeah, there was the London approach, which was sort of adopted by the banks. The risk, I think, in the early 70s was that if assets were sold on an accelerated basis, it would have a significant impact on value. So, holding certain assets back in the form of a dam was to ensure that the banks got better pricing when assets were sold. But those times have moved on clearly and developed, and as you say, he potentially used that as the backbone of the Cork report as prepared by the Cork committee. So clearly not all of the recommendations that he made at that time came to fruition, but I think you can see various aspects of what he was considering being adopted by other countries, but not necessarily embraced here.
I've got a copy of the Cork report and I've referred to it regularly. I was amused a couple of years ago. I had cause to have a look at it in connection with wrongful trading. and I was putting together the sort of history of wrongful trading and doing some talks on it. And I sort of had views on how to plead wrongful trading, how to succeed, how to calculate loss in particular. And I was fascinated that the Cork report goes into great detail about wrongful trading, analyses all the reasons, and then has a stab at trying to legislate. And this is sort of like a 3-page section is produced. I think it was found actually, as subsequent people have found, pinning down what wrongful trading is and how it should work has always been the difficulty. But you could see that it's useful to go back to the very start in 82, I think the Cork report was. I think it was about then.
I think they finally reported back, was it 1985? But
yes.
In terms of timing.
And then legislating around it and then trying to apply it has been fascinating sort of 40-year history of trying to create essentially an entire insolvency principle from scratch, and how difficult it was to carve out, identifying what the wrong was. And I found it a fascinating piece of history just to read the committee's views and attempts to try and wrestle with how would you turn the emotion or the intent into statutory language.
Absolutely. I mean, we're currently working in the Seychelles at the moment where we are looking to pursue an action for fraudulent and wrongful trading. And the main definitions within the legislation at the Seychelles for international business companies is basically lifted from the Insolvency Act in 1986.
Well, that's a perfect segue to sort of come up to the current date and Court Gully and what do you do? Because you don't appear much on the sort of UK websites and case boards so much. You're not involved in so much UK stuff. So you're a UK IP. What do you do with your day? Where do Court Gully do their insolvency?
60% of our work is overseas. I suppose we're looking to focus on high-end assignments, not focused on volume. We're working in the Seychelles, Cayman Islands, BVI, Channel Islands in terms of cases that we're progressing sort of outside of those jurisdictions. US in terms of Chapter 15 recognition. We've got ongoing litigation in Switzerland, in Hong Kong. We've got matters that we're currently dealing with, particularly in line with financial services, where we are looking to wind down funds. So that's an area that we've been focused on probably for the last 5 years, given the significant increase in private equity funds over the last sort of decade or so. That has established so-called zombie funds, similar in terms of definition to a company or a zombie company that would be considered here. But these are the funds themselves where the economics no longer make sense.
And is that all essentially UK regulated through UK license, or are you local license in local jurisdictions? How does that work?
Yeah, most of those entities would be domiciled outside of the UK. So they would be domiciled typically in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Mauritius, for example. So even a Singapore fund manager, the actual fund itself will probably be domiciled in the Cayman Islands.
So a UK license covers you for Caymans, or do you need a local joint, or how does that work?
Yeah, we're regulated here as portfolio managers by the FCA. So that allows us to intervene and wind down a portfolio as regulated by the FCA, and the FCA's approval would translate to most jurisdictions with which we operate, or would certainly be recognized where we would leverage off a third-party manager in a jurisdiction such as Luxembourg, who's then in a position to delegate responsibility to us because we are in turn regulated in the UK. And we would step in and wind down the portfolio, avoid a fire sale. So it would be a controlled sort of wind down, potentially over several years, looking to maximize value, but just to reflect the desire of the investors, the limited partners, to see a return of capital.
And are you a formal office holder? Are there different types of office, or what's the nature of the control you have over these companies? Does it?
Well, a structure of a fund would typically be a partnership. So you would have a general partner and you would have limited partners. The limited partners are, by definition, have limited responsibility, and they defer responsibility to the general partner. So the general partner would in most cases operate the fund, would have potentially have originated the fund, would actually have sort of drawn in investors. The general partner would then manage the assets. In a number of cases, that general manager would actually also be the liquidator when the fund has come to the end of its life, as defined under the partnership agreement. So the general partner itself can be replaced. If the general partner was replaced, we have the regulatory approvals to do that. And we have various structures globally which would allow us to step in as that general partner, as that manager at a local level to which the fund is domiciled. And then in turn, the fund will have invested often into companies. Those companies would be, those investments would in most cases be illiquid. And therefore it's working through a strategy to actually extract value. And we would, obviously one of the areas of expertise that most insolvency practitioners would have is to extract value in such circumstances. So it's really an extension of what one would do in a liquidation. But it just has the complexities of a fund structure that most of those funds are domiciled outside of the UK.
That's very niche. Do you get a lot of applicants for jobs from the insolvency profession, or your staff niche as well? Do they come from all over?
I think our staff are mostly niche. So they come from a banking background, from a private equity background. So we have a private equity team that is highly experienced, particularly in emerging markets. And we're building that team up. So we've just taken on a new partner based out of Frankfurt. And he's actually liquidating 2 Luxembourg funds, has actually just replaced a GP of a Luxembourg fund with the purpose of a wind down of the fund, a process to sell the underlying investments.
Well, I happen to know the story of one of your employees from about 3 or 4 years ago because I posted about it on LinkedIn. That I was on a plane to Dublin and I was given the very rear corner seat. There was supposed to be a window seat, but there was no window. And I was one of the last on the plane. And to get to my seat, I had to climb over the sleeping person in the middle seat who turned to have just got on a red eye from America. And before we'd even taken off, we started talking and I explaining why I was going to Dublin to an insolvency conference, and she mentioned she was actually looking for work, and she said, "What I'm really after is I'm trying to get an intro into Cork Gully," and I said, "I know Cork Gully," and I introduced her to you. So, and I got a very lovely thank you letter a few months later for taking kindness to a stranger on a plane. She described herself as. So that's a crazy coincidence, I suppose. Yeah, I forget what specialism was in, but she'd come over, and part of the reason was to look for a job with yourselves. So I'm glad I played a small part in the coincidental bumping together.
No, very much appreciated. So we're obviously in the process of building up the team, looking at those funds which are not just focused on emerging markets, but sort of the developed markets as well. So we consider that there is genuine potential, but it is a niche that we have focused on for the last 5 years. Highest profile assignment for us would actually be a Barrage, which is quite would be a well-known private equity firm that collapsed several years ago, being run out of the Middle East.
I've also heard that you've done some work on crypto. I can't remember if that's Mauritius, Seychelles, something like that.
Yeah, out of the Seychelles. So we're currently acting as liquidators of an investment platform with 100,000 users, and we were appointed almost 2 years ago now. We facilitated a distribution in crypto, within a handful of months. And unusually made that distribution as a distribution in specie within an insolvent liquidation, which is rare, but with committee approval here in the UK is something that one can also do.
So how did that work?
Well, the mechanism that we adopted was that we were conscious with regard to when making a distribution, the assets held were all in crypto, that the investors had put assets on the platform in crypto. There were no fiat bank accounts. So our ability to make a distribution in fiat was problematic. So we'd made the decision early on that distribution would need to be in crypto. We therefore looked to address what was a relevant issue, which was the KYC, know your client, with regard to making such distributions to such a significant number of creditors. So we engaged with one of the exchanges, and the process that we adopted was to distribute assets to the exchange, and the exchange would then break up those assets and distribute them to the creditors where the creditors held an account. So we would have identified how the assets should be broken up, agreed with this exchange that the assets, proportion of the assets be placed into an individual's or corporate wallet. And obviously in such circumstances, that customer of the exchange would then be able to access the wallet. And if they wish to convert the crypto to fiat, that was, of course, at their discretion, their choice. But we were therefore able to lean on the KYC that the exchange itself had undertaken. So, the only KYC that was required by us was on the exchange itself. So that's how there's a little bit more to it. But I think ultimately that was the process. We also looked to digitalize the claims process. So when creditors were actually claiming, they did so digitally across 20 different cryptocurrencies, which obviously made it slightly more challenging. And we had to sort of adapt our process. And then we agreed creditor claims using various algorithms so that we achieved a 97% accuracy against the company's records in using those algorithms. So there were variations for which we sort of manually would have pushed back, but it was a very successful process that we'd adopted in the end, which could be replicated going forward.
And how would you get paid in something like that? Were you paid in crypto, or how does that work?
Yeah, we have various accounts which we're in a position to trade crypto. So although we may be paid in stablecoin, USDC, we're able to convert that USDC into fiat. We would be billing in sterling, and therefore it's a relatively straightforward process for us to do that, literally directly trading, or potentially sort of going through the various accounts that we hold with others. I think what is interesting in this particular matter, similar to the approach taken with FTX, is that ordinarily, as you know, as a liquidator, you hold assets in various currencies. At the date of liquidation, you would normally convert those currencies into sterling, because it's sterling to which you're going to be using that as a currency for distribution. In this particular case, we chose to hold assets in their native currency and to rebalance the portfolio to take advantage of the uplift in asset values. That's where you would see a position with FTX, where creditors were receiving circa 160 cents on the dollar. It's because assets were held in their native form, at least in part. So that's the approach that we adopted at the request of the committee.
Would you say that assignment was a liquidation with unusual assets, or was it much more on your sort of portfolio management type sort of assignments? Is it? We all have insolvencies, which are, the underlying liquidation is the same, but the complexities in the nature of the asset. Was there something fundamentally different about doing something in crypto or a crypto platform?
I mean, there are some challenges with a liquidation of this nature. Custody, for example, where do you place the assets that are secure, that you are sufficiently comfortable? There are were relatively few custodians who were FCA regulated here in the UK. That was important for us. So, it is important to look at the detail, as we did, in terms of who we were genuinely interacting with when assets were being held on our behalf. In terms of, it is any investment platform with crypto, very similar principle. The assets were being traded to derive value, a yield, but also investments were made into other funds, and that was challenging. The governance generally within funds invested in crypto is perhaps not as we would hope or expect it to be. Even when those platforms themselves are regulated, it can be quite disappointing in terms of the the statements and information that you receive.
I suppose in coming back to normal insolvency practitioners, shall we say, you're regulated by the Institute of Chartered Accountants, I think.
That's right.
Do they inspect these files for these offshore things? Do they come within their jurisdiction to inspect? Or how are you monitored if there's so much that's sort of outside the UK jurisdiction?
Technically not. I mean, we are more generally as a firm regulated by the Institute of Chartered Accountants. So it comes under that sort of general sort of, remit in terms of our approach and conduct. Ultimately, there are requirements in the Seychelles, in the Cayman Islands, in the BVI. BVI has particular legislation in terms of regulation of IPs. But in terms of Cayman, there is no specific legislation, and that's very much a reflection in the Seychelles and certain other jurisdictions. We also operate out of Mauritius, and Mauritius actually has a sort of a regulated regime similar to the BVI.
I bumped into your colleague Anthony Cork a week or so ago. He tells me you're big into football at the moment now.
We have an interesting mandate, Eagle Football, which is a multi-club strategy. It has 3 key strategic investments in terms of the administration. We're obviously keeping an open mind in terms of a restructuring of the company and the wider group, but equally conscious that we were appointed by the qualifying floating charge holder, and they are looking to a recovery of their underlying debt. So, we will also look at whether or not we'll achieve a better value by selling the assets as opposed to a liquidation, alternatively selling the assets for the direct benefit of the secured creditors.
So where are these teams?
Teams are in Belgium, Brazil, and in France. So top flight clubs in terms of Brazil and in France. There are, of course, with any football club, there are challenges, particularly those clubs which have suffered from a lack of liquidity.
So they're not in a procedure. You're appointed over the parent. Is that right?
We're appointed over the parent. That we hold in those respective entities 90% plus of the shares in issuance.
So have you experienced the sort of phenomenon of the crazy bidders and the local bids and the fan bids or anything? Have you had any of that?
We've had multiple fan bids in Brazil, to which we've worked through. I suppose the most extreme offering was somebody was prepared to offer their Nintendo. That did put a smile on my face when I actually sort of saw that come through in terms of the bidding process. But I believe we've chosen to decline that offer.
I was looking forward to seeing some pictures of you maybe in some football shirts. I thought you might want to get a bit of publicity through this appointment and get your Instagram views up.
Obviously our focus, as you'd appreciate, is getting value for the assets. So rather than our publicity, it's achieving the purpose of the administration and achieving value. So there are some challenges, and we continue to work through those.
A very diplomatic answer, if I may say so. Just finishing off then, really. Anything else on your mind? Anything that you'd advise young IPs coming into the profession, or major things that you want changing in regulation or representation? Anything that particularly irks you?
I mean, given 60% of our work is overseas, we tend to find ourselves focused on unusual work. We would define, I suppose, as special situations. So we don't have a strong view in terms of the supervision from a UK perspective. We consider the UK to be heavily regulated as opposed to sort of some of the other jurisdictions that we deal with. Perhaps a move to a regulatory environment where corporates themselves are actually regulated is perhaps, in my mind, long overdue. I think regulating an individual is perhaps is a legacy issue. I think there are sort of moves afoot, if I'm not mistaken, to sort of make the partnership or the entity liable alongside the individual, but making a distinguish, particularly with large firms, between the individual and we appreciate the individuals potentially can be held personally liable. I mean that I think is often overlooked in terms of the responsibility that insolvency practitioners take. It's far removed from circumstances that most qualified accountants or lawyers would find themselves in. So I'm not sure that risk is always priced accordingly by insolvency practitioners.
Maybe I can end on a positive note there. Maybe thinking about the work that you do abroad, would you say that the reforms that your great grandfather or great uncle rather put in place or started, and the licensing regime that began in '86 has ended with a license that's has credibility internationally, allows you to do many things in many jurisdictions?
Yeah, I think it does. We're well respected overseas, and I think that's helped us on our fund side of the business. That has been a positive. That the fact that we step in as a fiduciary, I think is highly relevant, and have experience of taking responsibility.
That's a very positive note to end on. Stephen, thank you very much for being my guest. That's been Dodging Bullets, and I've just been reminded to tell you to like and subscribe if you like what you've heard, or indeed you just want to fill your train journey. Thank you very much.